I woke to the sharp sting of antiseptic in the air and the harsh mechanical beeping of monitors that felt louder than any sound I had ever heard. My eyelids were heavy, my vision blurred, the ceiling above me washed in a pale, sterile light that did not belong to any place I recognized. For a long moment, I thought I was already gone. I thought this must be what the afterlife looked like. A cold room, humming machines, strangers moving in shadows. My chest burned with every shallow breath, my ribs felt crushed, and my skin carried the weight of broken glass and torn metal. Memory returned in fragments, jagged pieces of a nightmare. The screech of tires on wet asphalt, the violent lurch as the truck veered into the barrier, the sensation of my body slamming against the seatbelt, the world flipping sideways, and then silence broken only by my own ragged gasp. And above it all, one undeniable truth. Rick had left me there. My stepfather, the man my mother chose to marry after my real father died, had turned a highway into a weapon and my body into a sacrifice. For what? For money. For $3 million of insurance he had secretly placed on my life. I remember the way my vision dimmed, the smell of fuel mixing with blood, and the thought that this was how it would end for me at 19. Not in a blaze of love or accomplishment, but bleeding on Route 5 while the man sworn to protect me walked away. I heard the faint wail of sirens approaching, and for a second, hope fluttered. But then his voice, cold and steady, echoed in my mind the lie he told into the phone. My stepdaughter is gone. She's dead. With those words, he signed me away. He chose money over family. He chose greed over my life. Even as my heart faltered and darkness crept in, part of me wanted to fight. I thought of my father, the real one who used to tell me I was stronger than I knew. I thought of UMass Amherst, the future I had been saving toward with every late-night shift at Duncan. I thought of the life Rick was trying to erase before it had even begun. Then nothing. Blackness. When I opened my eyes again, it was in a room that smelled of bleach and sounded like machines. A nurse bent over me, her eyes widening in disbelief, as if I had clawed my way back from the grave. And maybe I had. But the memory that surged through me then was not of the accident itself. It was of Sterling Grill, the expensive restaurant in downtown Springfield, where Rick liked to play the role of a self-made man. I saw it as clearly as if I were there. The polished wood, the glitter of glasses, the hush of diners pausing mid-bite. I saw two officers push through the door, their uniforms stark against the elegance of the room. I heard the words that froze everything. Your stepdaughter is dead. That pronouncement fell like a gavel, sealing me in the minds of everyone present as already gone. Rick accepted it. He believed it. Maybe he even let relief soften his face, certain his plan had succeeded. But as I lay in that hospital bed, tubes in my arms and stitches tightening across my skin, I felt the weight of survival. I was alive against every odd. They thought my story ended on that highway. They thought I would never open my mouth again. But I had returned broken, yet breathing, and survival meant only one thing. Everything was about to change. They thought I was gone, but I wasn't. Springfield, Massachusetts was supposed to be a place of beginnings for me, but inside our small two-story house on Orange Street, it felt like an unending sentence. From the outside, our home looked ordinary, even inviting. Neighbors would wave when I mowed the lawn, and Susan, my mother, made polite small talk about weather or grocery sales. To the world, we looked like any family trying to get by. But behind the front door, everything shifted. Rick Morrison, my stepfather, turned that house into a cage. When my father died of pancreatic cancer, I was only 12. The grief was sharp, but what cut deeper was how quickly Rick stepped in. At first, he seemed like the answer to prayers my mother never voiced. He paid the mortgage, fixed the roof, and drove us to St. Michael's Church every other Sunday. He said things like, "Don't worry. Susan, I'll take care of everything," and she believed him. Maybe she wanted to. Maybe she was too tired to stand on her own. But taking care of everything didn't mean protecting us. It meant controlling us. It meant owning us. By the time I turned 14, I learned silence was safer than questions. Rick had a way of twisting small mistakes into excuses for punishment. If I left a glass in the sink, he would slam his fist on the counter and shout, "Ungrateful brat!" If I rolled my eyes, he might yank me by the arm hard enough to leave bruises. My mother always stood nearby, her face pale, whispering, "Just do as he says, Aubrey. Please." At first, I thought she was protecting me. Later, I realized she was protecting herself. I started working at Dunkin' Donuts on State Street when I was 16. I told everyone it was for pocket money for the independence most teenagers craved. The truth was, I wanted an escape fund. Each paycheck, no matter how small, I tucked away into a jar I hid behind my old winter sweaters. I told myself one day I'd walk across the campus of UMass Amherst, books in my arms, free of Rick's shadow. That dream kept me moving during the late-night shifts when my feet ached and my eyelids begged for sleep. Rick had his own routines, darker ones. He spent hours at MGM Springfield Casino feeding slot machines, losing money he didn't have. Nights he came home broke were the worst. His anger boiled over and I became the target. Once when I was 17, he shoved me against the staircase so hard I thought my ribs had cracked. My mother rushed forward but froze halfway as if invisible chains held her in place. Later, she brought me ice in a towel and whispered, "You can't provoke him, Aubrey. He's under so much stress." Stress. That was her excuse when he slammed doors, broke plates, or left bruises. Stress was the reason she gave for staying married to him. But I knew better. She stayed because she didn't know how to survive without him. Her nursing license had lapsed years ago, and she leaned on him for every bill. Dependency disguised itself as loyalty, but I saw the truth every night I lay awake, listening to her muffled sobs through the thin walls. The worst part wasn't the bruises or the shouting. It was how Rick chipped away at my sense of self piece by piece. He'd scoff at my grades no matter how high they were. When I proudly showed him my acceptance letter to UMass, he glanced at it and muttered, "Don't waste your time. You'll drop out in a year. You don't have what it takes." Each word planted doubt like weeds in my chest, but beneath the fear, anger burned. Quiet, steady waiting. Then, at 18, I stumbled on something that turned that anger into suspicion. One afternoon, I was dusting the living room, one of Rick's endless chores meant to remind me I lived in his house, when I knocked over the drawer of his desk. Papers scattered across the floor. As I gathered them, a thick envelope caught my eye. It was addressed from an insurance company. The words, "Accidental Death Rider," were bold at the top. My name appeared again and again, listed as the insured. The figure at the bottom nearly stopped my breath, $3 million. At first, I thought it had to be a mistake. Why would anyone take out a life insurance policy that large on a 19-year-old? But as I read the clauses, the dates, the signatures, dread crawled up my spine. Rick had signed it only 3 months earlier. He hadn't asked for my permission. My mother's name wasn't anywhere on the document. It was Rick's signature alone. I tucked the papers back, my hands shaking so badly I almost tore them. That night at dinner, I couldn't look at him without picturing the number. 3 million. Every time his fork scraped the plate, it sounded like a countdown. When he glanced at me, it felt like a calculation. Suddenly, every bruise, every shove, every insult seemed less like random cruelty and more like preparation. I tried to warn my mother. "Mom, I think Rick took out some kind of policy on me," I whispered one night while we washed dishes. Her hand froze on the sponge water dripping down her wrist. For a moment, fear flared in her eyes, but just as quickly it vanished behind a practiced mask. "You're imagining things," she said firmly, scrubbing harder. "He would never," but her voice trembled, betraying her. That was when I realized she knew. Maybe not the details, but she knew enough. And she chose silence. She chose him. The betrayal stung more than Rick's fists ever had. Looking back, I see now how the trap was being set piece by piece. Rick's late nights at the casino weren't just about gambling. They were about desperation. His debts piled up. His pride couldn't bear the collapse. And in his twisted logic, I was the solution. I was the payout. I wish I could say I left that night, packed my jar of money, and walked to the nearest bus station. But fear is a powerful chain. I told myself I was exaggerating. I told myself I could survive until college started in the fall. I convinced myself that staying quiet was safer than challenging him. But silence is what nearly killed me, because less than a month later, Rick invited me on a drive down Route 5. He said it was for errands. My mother smiled nervously, urging me to go, and I went because I was still that girl who wanted peace more than confrontation. I didn't know it then, but I was stepping into his plan, into the jaws of the crash that would change everything. I remember the morning of that drive with a clarity that still makes my chest tighten. It was early April, the kind of gray New England morning when the sky feels too heavy pressing down on every street in Springfield. I woke to the sound of Rick banging around in the kitchen. The clatter of pots and the hiss of coffee brewing weren't unusual, but the mood was. He was humming under his breath off-key and restless. Rick only hummed when he thought he was about to win something. When I walked in, he was dressed sharper than usual. A pressed button-down, his leather belt polished, and the burgundy tie I had seen him wear only at weddings and court dates. He glanced at me, once his eyes flicking over me like I was inventory. "Get dressed. We've got errands to run. Route 5. His tone left no room for questions. My mother, Susan, stood at the sink, drying her hands on a towel. She wouldn't meet my eyes. The silence between us was so thick I could almost hear her thoughts. This wasn't right. She knew it and I knew it, but fear held her tongue. When Rick walked into the garage, I whispered, "Please, Mom, tell me not to go." Her lips parted, but no words came out. Instead, she pressed the towel against the counter as if it could anchor her. Finally, she whispered so softly I almost missed it, "Just do what he says." That sentence sliced me open. Just do what he says. That had been her anthem for years. It was how she survived, but survival for her meant surrender for me. I went upstairs, pulled on jeans and a sweatshirt, and slipped my jar of savings into my backpack. Something in me screamed that I wouldn't be coming back. The truck smelled of stale smoke and cheap air freshener when I climbed in. Rick kept the windows cracked even in cold weather, like he needed to air out the evidence of his habits. He drummed his fingers on the steering wheel, an erratic rhythm that matched the pounding in my chest. Seatbelt, he barked, though he rarely wore his own. I clicked it into place, my palms slick. We pulled out onto Route 5, the road stretching ahead like a strip of uncertainty. The Connecticut River glimmered faintly to our right, swollen from spring rains. I stared at the water, thinking of freedom, thinking of escape. Rick cleared his throat. "You know, Aubrey people don't appreciate what I do for this family." His voice was smooth rehearsed. "Your mother would be nothing without me. And you'd be some dropout working night shifts forever." He laughed low and bitter. "You should be grateful. Grateful. For the bruises, for the nights of fear, for the way he drained every ounce of peace from our home." I stayed silent, but my grip on the seat tightened. He accelerated faster than usual, weaving slightly. Cars honked as he cut lanes. My stomach knotted. I wanted to tell him to slow down, but I knew how he'd react. Any challenge was an insult. Instead, I stared at the speedometer climbing past 60-70. His words slurred into a rant about Bill's, the casino, how no one respected him. Then, quieter almost to himself, he muttered, "Things will be easier soon." My throat went dry. Easier. The word carried a weight I didn't want to unpack. I thought about the insurance papers I had seen, the way he looked at me like a liability and an asset all at once. My pulse hammered so loudly I almost couldn't hear the tires roaring on the asphalt. I turned my head and studied his face in profile. He wasn't just angry. He was determined. And determination, I realized in that moment, was far more dangerous. Anger flared and burned out. Determination built and executed. I thought of my father, of the nights he tucked me in when I was a child, telling me, "You have to know the difference between people who protect you and people who use you." I had been too young to understand then. Now, sitting in that truck with Rick, I knew the difference in my bones. The irony was cruel. I had been saving every dollar to leave Springfield, to carve out a life of independence, but the man who claimed to provide for us was ready to cash me out like a lottery ticket. The ride dragged on, every mile stretching thin. Rick lit a cigarette, cracked the window, and exhaled with satisfaction. "You ever think about what would happen if you weren't around?" His question hung in the air like poison. I couldn't answer. I wouldn't give him the satisfaction. He smirked at my silence. "Figures. You've never understood sacrifice." I clenched my fists in my lap. Sacrifice. That was the word my mother used when she defended him. She said he sacrificed for us, that his gambling was stress relief, that his temper was just the cost of security. I thought of the towel she had twisted in her hands that morning, the way her lips had pressed together instead of speaking the truth. Her silence was sacrifice too, but not for me. For him. Always for him. As we approached the industrial stretch of Route 5 where concrete barriers lined the road and traffic thinned, my nerves screamed. Rick's hands tightened on the wheel. The humming stopped. The air felt charged heavy. My instinct whispered that this was it. I shifted slightly, sliding my backpack closer to my legs, the jar of money rattling faintly inside. If I survived, I told myself I would not waste another second in that house. If I survived, the words echoed like a prayer. Looking back now, I see that entire drive as the prelude to disaster. The signs were there in every word he spoke, every mile he drove, every silence from my mother that morning. But when you are 19 and trapped in a house with someone like Rick, you learn to normalize the unthinkable. You tell yourself maybe today will be different. Maybe this time it will stop short of catastrophe. I didn't know then how close I was to losing everything. I didn't know that within minutes, metal would fold like paper, blood would stain the seatbelt, and my name would be stamped onto a police report that declared me dead. All I knew was that I was trapped in a moving cage with a man who valued money more than my life. And there was no turning back. The rain had started just as we crossed into the industrial stretch of Route 5. Not the gentle drizzle that makes the Connecticut River shimmer, but the kind of hard, slanting rain that turns the windshield into a curtain of moving glass. The wipers beat frantically, but Rick didn't slow down. If anything, he pressed harder on the gas, his jaw set, his fingers locked on the steering wheel. My heart thudded against my ribs, each beat echoing with the voice in my head that screamed, "He is going to do it! He is going to kill you!" I stole a glance at him. His lips were pressed tight, the cigarette in the ashtray smoldering, forgotten. His eyes weren't wide with panic or narrowed with anger. They were calm, focused, like a man following through on a decision already made. I wanted to tell him to stop the truck, to let me out to scream until my throat tore. But fear had its grip on me. My voice died in my chest, leaving only shallow, shaky breaths that fogged the glass. My backpack sat heavy at my feet, the jar of coins rattling with each bump. All my hope, all my years of saving, compressed into a glass jar that seemed laughably fragile compared to the weight of the moment. We passed a billboard for MGM Springfield, its bright lights dulled by rain. Rick muttered something under his breath. I only caught fragments. Debts. Payoff. Clean slate. My pulse spiked. He wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. This was about money. About the $3 million policy. When the road curved near the Chicopee exit, I realized the traffic had thinned. Only a few headlights cut through the storm behind us. To the right, concrete barriers hemmed us in the river hidden beyond. To the left, a drop-off lined with guardrails. No easy escape. Rick's hands tightened, and I swear I heard him inhale sharply like a diver about to plunge. "Rick!" I whispered, forcing the word out, though my throat burned. "Please, slow down." He didn't answer. He flicked the wipers to their fastest setting, the blades squealing, his eyes locked straight ahead. The silence between us stretched unbearable before he finally spoke. "You don't understand sacrifice, Aubrey. But you're about to." That sentence cut through me like a blade. In it was everything: his resentment, his desperation, his intent. My body froze, but my mind raced. I thought of my mother's face that morning, pale and tight, telling me to just do what he says. Did she know? Did she suspect what he planned? Or was she too far gone in her dependency to admit it? The truck surged forward 70-80 miles an hour. Rain hammered so hard I could barely see the road. My seatbelt cut into my shoulder as the truck swayed. Panic clawed up my throat, raw and electric. My breaths came fast, shallow, as I searched for any chance to survive. Headlights flared ahead, a sedan slowing for the weather. Rick didn't ease off. Instead, he jerked the wheel left, skidding dangerously close to the guardrail before swerving back into the lane. The sedan's horn blared, its lights flashing as it veered away. I gasped, clutching the seat. Rick just smirked, the corner of his mouth twitching. See how easy it is to lose control. That was when I knew with absolute certainty. This wasn't reckless driving. This wasn't anger. This was deliberate. He was waiting for the right stretch of road, waiting for the moment when the world would believe it was an accident. My hands shook so badly I could barely hold on to the seat. I thought of my father's voice, the one memory that had never left me. Know the difference between people who protect you and people who use you. I had always clung to that line, but now it was all I had. Rick had never protected me. He had always used me, and now he was ready to discard me. The rain grew heavier, the world outside reduced to streaks of light and shadow. Rick's knuckles were white against the wheel. I watched his right foot press harder on the accelerator, the speedometer needle creeping toward 90. My chest tightened, my vision tunneling. I wanted to scream. I wanted to grab the wheel. I wanted to do anything but sit there helpless. But before I could act, he made his move. The truck jerked violently to the right. Tires screeched the sound, ripping through the storm as rubber fought against slick pavement. The concrete barrier loomed closer and closer until it filled the windshield. My body slammed against the seatbelt pane, tearing through my ribs as metal shrieked. The impact roared like thunder, the truck shuddering, glass exploding into the storm. My head snapped sideways, a burst of white light filling my skull. For a moment, there was silence. Just the hiss of rain on broken glass, the ticking of the engine cooling. Then, the copper taste of blood spread across my tongue. My left arm hung useless, twisted at an angle that made bile rise in my throat. Every breath was agony, sharp and shallow. I turned my head, vision swimming, and saw Rick. His seatbelt undone, his face set in grim determination. He looked at me, not with shock, not with concern, but with cold calculation. His lips parted, and he said the words that seared into me forever. "Stay down." Then he opened the door, stepped out into the rain, and walked away. Through the pounding in my ears, I caught fragments. The click of his phone, his voice steady, almost rehearsed. "My stepdaughter's gone. She's dead. Send help, but it's too late." I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell the dispatcher I was still here, still fighting, still alive. But all I could manage was a gurgle, blood choking the sound. My vision blurred, the world dimming. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder, but so did the darkness creeping at the edges of my sight. As the rain soaked through my sweatshirt and pooled beneath me, one thought circled in my mind. He left me for dead, for money, for $3 million. The sirens were almost on top of us when my body gave out, my head slumping to the side. My last glimpse was of Rick standing near the barrier, arms folded as if he were simply waiting for confirmation. He didn't look back at me. He didn't need to. In his mind, I was already gone. The sirens grew louder, splitting the storm, and yet all I could focus on was the strange stillness inside my body. My lungs struggled, my ribs stabbed with every shallow inhale, but it felt distant, as if I was floating just above myself, watching a girl bleed out on wet asphalt. The rain poured through the shattered window, cold needles piercing my skin. My vision blurred, clearing in flashes, showing me glimpses of headlights reflecting off shards of glass scattered like stars across the road. I remember hearing Rick's voice again, calm and steady, as though he were reading from a script. "Yes, officer. She didn't make it. She slammed into the barrier. I tried, but there was nothing to be done. She's gone." His words were meant for the dispatcher, but they pierced me sharper than any piece of glass embedded in my skin. He wasn't panicked. He wasn't broken. He was composed, rehearsed, already preparing for the payday. A hand touched my pulse, firm and quick. Another voice, younger, strained with urgency. "She's unresponsive. We've got no heartbeat." The sound of scissors slicing fabric followed my sweatshirt peeling away, exposing bruised skin to the cold. I wanted to scream, "I'm here! I'm not gone!" Don't believe him. But my body betrayed me. My chest refused to rise on its own. My heart had faltered. In that moment, I was dead to them. The EMT's voice cut through the haze. Time of death, but I never heard the minute he called. Darkness swallowed me whole. What pulled me back wasn't light or warmth. It was pain. A white-hot surge as paddles pressed against my chest, the crackle of electricity jolting me. My body arched, slammed back down. Once. Twice. Then faint, but undeniable, the monitor stuttered into a rhythm. Weak, but present. "She's back," someone shouted. "Get her loaded. Move." The world rushed around me, blurred figures in reflective jackets, the slam of doors, the rattle of wheels as they slid me into the ambulance. My head lolled to the side, and for a fleeting second, I saw him. Rick stood by the barrier, rain streaming down his face. His tie loosened, his hands shoved into his pockets. His expression wasn't shock or relief. It was irritation, the look of a man whose plan had hit a snag. Inside the ambulance, the paramedics worked with fierce urgency. One secured an oxygen mask over my face. Another checked IV lines. I caught fragments of their words, BP dropping. Probable concussion. Left shoulder dislocated. The language was clinical efficient, but underneath it, I heard something else: disbelief. Disbelief that someone pulled back from the brink after already being declared gone. The ride to Bay State Medical Center blurred into a series of jolts and muffled commands. My body floated between agony and numbness, but my mind clung to one truth: Rick believed I was dead. To him, the story was finished. But I was still here, stitched together by stubbornness and chance. The ER lights blinded me as they rushed me through sliding doors. Nurses swarmed, doctors barked orders. I felt hands manipulating my shoulder, a wrenching pop that made stars explode across my vision. My throat released a scream, muffled by the oxygen mask, raw and guttural. A nurse's eyes widened. "She's responsive." The words traveled like a shockwave through the room. Somewhere in the haze, I heard another voice. A cop's voice. "Female firm." "Wait, this is Aubrey Collins." Papers shuffled. She was declared deceased at the scene. The words hit like ice water. Declared deceased. It was official. On record. Rick hadn't just told the dispatcher I was dead, police had already accepted it. In their eyes, I had ceased to exist. But there I was, trembling on the gurney, bloodied but breathing, defying the declaration. The irony cut deeper than any wound. He thought he had erased me. Instead, I had become the evidence. The next hours dissolved into fragments, 4 drips, stitches tugging across my scalp, the bitter taste of saline. Through it all, I kept picturing Rick's face at the barrier, the way he didn't flinch when they said I was gone. That image burned into me, fueling something beyond fear. Rage. Survival wasn't just about me anymore. It was about making sure his plan unraveled in front of the world. When the morphine dulled the worst of the pain, I forced my lips to form words. The nurse leaned closer, straining to hear. "Don't call him," I rasped, her brows knit together. "Sweetheart, he's your emergency contact." My head throbbed as I shook it, every movement sharp with pain. "No, not him." That was when Officer Ben Walker appeared. I recognized him even through the blur. He had known my dad before cancer stole him. His eyes, tired but kind, narrowed as he saw me awake. "Aubrey," he said softly, leaning down. "Do you understand where you are?" I swallowed, tasting blood. "Hospital," I whispered. "But they told him I was dead." My voice cracked. Ben's jaw tightened. He glanced at the nurse, then back at me. "We'll sort that out. You just focus on breathing." But I saw it in his eyes, the confirmation that what I feared was true. My death had already been logged, and Rick had been told the story he wanted to hear. That night, as I drifted in and out of consciousness, I imagined him at the Sterling Grill. I could see the restaurant in perfect detail, the polished wood, the crystal glasses, the hush that fell when police officers walked in. I pictured the moment they told him, "Your stepdaughter is dead." Did he let himself smile? Did he feel the weight of his debts lifting, replaced by the promise of $3 million? I wanted to be there when his smile faded. I wanted to stand in that same room, broken but alive, and force him to face what he had tried to destroy. That thought kept me awake through the beeping of machines and the sting of sutures. The accident had nearly ended me, but now it was the beginning of something else, a war for truth, for survival, and for justice. I don't remember being wheeled into Bay State Medical Center as clearly as I remember the ceiling tiles above me. They were a pale off-white each square, stained slightly different from years of fluorescent light. Some had faint water rings, others cracks like spider webs. My vision kept drifting in and out, but those tiles tethered me something to count while my mind fought not to slip away again. Every sound was magnified, the squeak of sneakers on polished floor, the metallic clatter of instruments being prepared, the low murmur of nurses trading terms that blurred together BP unstable, concussion suspected, prepping for scans. My body floated between agony and numbness, and I wondered if this was what it felt like to live halfway between two worlds. Then I caught the words that froze me completely. She was declared deceased at the scene. The voice came from the nurse at the desk, matter of fact, as she handed over paperwork. My breath hitched, the oxygen mask fogging with panic. Declared deceased. That wasn't just Rick's lie anymore. It was official, written into reports. I existed only because machines insisted on it. In the eyes of the law, I was already gone. A doctor leaned over me, his eyes ringed with exhaustion. "Aubrey, can you hear me?" His voice was calm but urgent. I blinked slowly, forcing my body to obey. He nodded. "Good. Stay with us." He adjusted my shoulder and lightning bolts of pain shot through my body, making me cry out. "Dislocation," he muttered to a resident. "We'll reduce it. Prepare sedation." Even as medication dulled my senses, the words declared deceased echoed. I wanted to shout that I was here alive, that they couldn't let him win by writing me off like a number on a page. But the drugs pulled me under before I could speak. When I woke, the room was quieter. Dim light glowed from a lamp in the corner. My head throbbed, my arm strapped to my side, an IV dripping steadily. For a moment, I thought I was alone. Then I heard voices just beyond the curtain. "She was gone," Janet one said. "Flatlined." Morrison already told dispatch she was dead. "Hell, the report's typed." A second voice, sharper female, answered. "Reports can be wrong, Ben. She's breathing now. That's all that matters." My chest tightened. Officer Ben Walker. He'd known my father. And the other voice, it had to be Officer Janet Rivera. My father had mentioned her once years ago when she was new on the force. Now they were here arguing over whether I should even exist. The curtain rustled, and Ben stepped in, his lined face, creased with something between relief and sorrow. He crouched beside me, his voice low. "Aubrey, it's Ben. You're safe here. Do you know what happened?" I swallowed, my throat raw. "Rick, he left me." My voice cracked. "Told them I was dead." Ben's jaw clenched. His hand rested on the rail of my bed. "I know. We heard the call." He didn't sound panicked. He sounded prepared. He exhaled slowly, as if steadying himself. "Aubrey, you need to understand something. He's already filed the claim." The words hit harder than any impact. "Claim," Janet appeared, then her dark hair pulled back, her uniform crisp despite the late hour. She studied me with eyes that missed nothing. $3 million, she said flatly. "He took out a policy on you months ago. Accidental death rider. Filed for payout within an hour of the crash." My breath caught. So it was true. The papers I'd found weren't paranoia. They were a blueprint. He hadn't just thought about it, he had put it into motion. He wanted me erased, and the world had nearly cooperated. Tears blurred my vision, hot and humiliating. "My mom," she knew I whispered. She didn't stop him. Neither officer argued. Their silence said everything. Janet stepped closer, her tone firm but not unkind. "Listen to me, Aubrey. You're alive, and that changes everything. But if you want justice, you have to be strong, stronger than you've ever been. Do you understand?" I nodded, though my whole body trembled. Strength felt impossible. Every rib ached, my head throbbed, my skin stung from cuts. But beneath it all, rage simmered. He had tried to cash me out like a ticket at the casino, and he thought he had succeeded. He told the world I was dead. But here I was, staring back at the people who could help me bring him down. Ben's voice softened. "Your father once told me you had his fire. Don't let Rick take that from you." The mention of my father cracked something open in me. I saw his face in my memory pale in a hospital bed, but smiling as he held my hand. He had fought until his last breath, not for himself, but for me. If I gave in now, Rick won twice, once by trying to kill me and again by breaking the part of me my father had protected. I wiped at my eyes clumsily with my good hand. What do we do? Janet's gaze didn't waver. We gather proof, we expose him, and we make sure when this goes to court the jury sees the monster he is. For the first time since the crash, my heartbeat steadied. The machines beeped a rhythm that matched the pulse of determination rising in me. I had been declared dead, but now I was something else, evidence witness survivor, and Rick Morrison had no idea I was still breathing. The following morning, the hospital room felt less like a place of healing and more like a war room. Sunlight filtered weakly through the blinds, dust motes floating in its beams, but nothing about the atmosphere felt calm. My chart sat at the foot of the bed, a glaring reminder that somewhere in the system I was both dead and alive, declared deceased on paper. Breathing in reality. Nurse Patricia, with her steady hands and practiced calm, checked my vitals. She gave me a look that was half sympathy, half disbelief. "You're a miracle, honey," she said, scribbling notes. "But miracles come with questions. The police are still downstairs trying to sort out the paperwork mess. One report says you're gone. Another says you made it through surgery." She squeezed my arm gently. "Don't let them confuse you. You're here. That's what matters." But the truth was, confusion wasn't my fear. My fear was that Rick was out there celebrating my supposed death, free to spin the narrative before I even had the strength to stand. As if summoned by the thought, Janet Rivera appeared at my door, her uniform crisp, her expression carved in stone. Behind her trailed Ben Walker, his tie loosened from a sleepless night. Janet closed the door, her voice firm but low. "Aubrey, we've confirmed he called the insurance company. Filed a claim at 11:42 p.m. That was barely 2 hours after you were brought here." The air left my lungs. He didn't even wait. Ben's jaw tightened. Not a second. He walked into Sterling Grill, ordered himself a steak, and told anyone who would listen that his stepdaughter died in a tragic accident. He even raised a glass. The image seared itself into me. While I lay unconscious with machines keeping me alive, he toasted my death. My stomach turned, but rage steadied me. Janet slid a folder onto the bedside table. Inside were photographs, grainy security stills from Route 5 time-stamped the night of the crash. They showed Rick's truck swerving deliberately into the barrier. Not weather, not accident, intent. Next to it, copies of the insurance paperwork. My name in bold print. $3 million listed like the value of a car, not a human life. I stared until the letters blurred. "He planned this," I whispered. Ben nodded. "We believe so. The gambling debts, the casino markers, it all lines up. He saw you as a way out." For a moment, grief threatened to crush me. Not grief for Rick, but for my mother. Susan had to have known something. Her silence that morning wasn't ignorance, it was complicity. That betrayal cut deeper than any of Rick's blows. "Where is she?" I asked finally. My voice was sharp, brittle. Ben and Janet exchanged a look. Janet spoke first. "She's at home. She hasn't called to check on you." My chest tightened. Even after the crash, even after hearing I'd been declared dead, my mother hadn't walked through the hospital doors. That silence spoke louder than any words. Janet leaned closer, her eyes steady on mine. "Aubrey, I need to ask you something. Are you willing to testify? To tell the court exactly what happened in that truck?" Fear surged, thick and paralyzing. Testifying meant facing him. It meant telling the world how he tried to kill me. But then I remembered the sound of his voice saying, "She's dead," the casual tone, the certainty. My fear hardened into resolve. "Yes," I said. My voice wavered, but the word was solid. "He doesn't get to bury me while I'm still breathing." Janet's stern expression softened for the first time. "Good. Because this isn't just about survival anymore. It's about making sure he never does this to anyone else." The next days blurred into a cycle of painkillers, physical therapy exercises, and late-night strategy sessions with Ben and Janet. Each time they returned, they brought more proof. bank statements showing Rick's losses at MGM Springfield, surveillance footage of him meeting with shady loan sharks in a downtown parking lot. Even a neighbor's testimony, Mr. Chin from across the street, who told officers he overheard Rick calling me a walking ATM just weeks before the crash. Each piece stacked higher, building a mountain of evidence that Rick had traded fatherhood for greed. But evidence wasn't enough. Janet was clear. The public has to see it. The jury has to feel it. This case won't just be about documents. It'll be about your voice, Aubrey. Her words both terrified and steadied me. My voice had been silenced for years under Rick's roof. Now it was the weapon he could never take. One evening, as the monitors beeped softly and rain tapped against the windows, Ben sat beside my bed. He spoke quietly, his tone more fatherly than official. "You know your dad used to brag about you. Said you had a spark he could never put out. I think he'd be proud to see you here refusing to let this man write your ending." Tears filled my eyes, but they weren't just from grief. They were from the spark Ben spoke of, the fire I felt rising despite the pain. My father had fought cancer with every ounce of strength. How could I do less now? That night, I dreamed of Sterling Grill again. I saw Rick lifting his glass, smirking as he announced my death. But this time, the dream shifted. I saw the doors open, police walking in diners turning to stare. I saw his face as they told him the truth. Not that I was dead, but that I was alive and that his lies were crumbling around him. When I woke, sweat cooling on my skin, I realized something. Surviving the crash was only half the battle. The other half was reclaiming my life in public, making sure everyone knew exactly what he had done. They thought I was gone. They wrote me off, signed my name under deceased. But every breath I took in that hospital bed was a reminder. I was still here, and I was ready to fight. Lying in that hospital bed, tethered to machines, I had more time than I wanted to think. The painkillers dulled the sharpest edges of my injuries, but they couldn't stop the flood of memories. They came, uninvited, rushing in like the storm on Route 5, dragging me back through the years that had led me here. I was 12 when Rick moved into our house on Bay Street in Springfield. My father had been gone 2 years, cancer stealing him in the quiet, merciless way it always does. My mother was fragile then, thinner than I'd ever seen her, her eyes ringed with shadows. When Rick first arrived, he seemed like a rescuer. He had broad shoulders, a booming laugh, and a confidence that filled the empty spaces grief had left. For a while, even I wanted to believe he was the answer. But rescues sometimes come with chains. It started small rules that felt more like control than guidance. Don't eat that much, Aubrey. Don't talk back. Don't waste electricity. Soon, it wasn't rules. It was slaps when I answered wrong. A shove into the wall when I moved too slowly. My mother would flinch but say nothing, folding laundry with her head bowed, as if pretending blindness could erase the sound of my cries. By 14, I had learned the choreography of his rage. The way his footsteps sounded different when he'd lost at the casino. The smell of whiskey on his breath before his hand connected with my face. I learned that silence was both shield and prison. The less I said, the less he had to twist against me. My mother's silence was worse than his blows. I'd look to her desperate for rescue, but she'd only wring her hands and whisper, "Just do what he says, Aubrey. Don't make it worse." Her dependence on him became her excuse. He paid the mortgage, he brought groceries, he filled the fridge with beer and pretended it was provision, and in return, she surrendered her voice. When I was 16, I got my first job at the Dunkin' Donuts near Main Street. The smell of coffee and sugar clung to my hair, my clothes, my skin, but it also came with paychecks. Small, yes, but mine. Every shift meant another few dollars toward my dream of UMass Amherst. I stashed the cash in a jar in my closet, labeling it in my head as freedom. Each coin was a step away from Rick, but Rick noticed. He always noticed. One night, he cornered me in the kitchen, slamming the jar on the table so hard the coins rattled like alarm bells. "What's this? You planning on leaving us? You think you're better than me?" His breath was hot, his eyes bloodshot from losing at MGM Springfield again. I stood frozen, but inside, something cracked. "It's my money," I said, my voice trembling but audible. I earned it. His hand flew faster than my eyes could track. The slap spun me sideways, my cheek blazing. The jar tipped coins scattering across the floor like tiny explosions. My mother rushed in then, her hands fluttering uselessly. "Rick, please stay out of this," he barked, shoving her aside. She fell against the counter, her silence sealing the moment. I scrambled to gather the coins, tears blurring my vision, but each one felt heavier than it had before. That night, I hid the jar deeper inside my backpack, vowing he would never take it from me. His gambling only worsened. MGM Springfield was his temple, the roulette wheel his god. I'd see the markers come in the mail, thousands owed deadlines looming. He'd rip them open with shaking hands, curse, then storm out to lose more. When he returned, it was with fury. The house became a pressure cooker, every door slam a warning of the explosion to come. At 17, I broke 2 ribs after he shoved me down the stairs during one of his tirades. I told people at school I tripped, but Ben Walker saw through me. He came by once checking in as an old family friend. He looked at the bruises on my arms the way I flinched when Rick came near, but my mother stood beside Rick smiling too brightly, insisting everything was fine. Ben left that night with suspicion in his eyes, but without proof, what could he do? I used to think my mother was trapped just like me. But as I lay in that hospital bed replaying those years, I realized she wasn't just trapped, she had chosen her prison. She'd convinced herself Rick was her lifeline, even as he dragged me under. The insurance policy had been the final confirmation. A few months before the crash, I had found the folder in the locked drawer of his desk. My name bold across the page, the payout circled in red ink, $3 million. My stomach had dropped. I'd wanted to confront him, but fear stopped me. Instead, I folded the paper back and pretended I hadn't seen. But from that moment, every time he looked at me, I wondered if he saw a girl or a dollar sign. Now in the stillness of the hospital, I knew the truth. He had seen both and chosen the latter. There were nights when I'd lie awake in my room on Bay Street, the hum of the refrigerator downstairs, the only sound between me and whatever mood Rick carried through the door. I'd stare at the glow-in-the-dark stars I'd stuck to the ceiling years earlier, back when I was still a kid and believed wishes could change things. By 17, those stars weren't magic anymore. They were reminders that the light I longed for was only plastic while the darkness was real. I learned to predict him like weather. The slam of the car door meant he'd lost money. The slower creak of the steps meant he'd broken even. And when he whistled off-key, that meant he'd won enough to feel untouchable. Those were the nights I feared most. Victory made him crueler than loss. Loss sent him to sulk. Winning made him want to prove control. My mother adjusted herself around him like furniture. She patted softly, spoke in whispers, made herself invisible. She called it keeping the peace, but peace built on silence is just another form of war. I asked her once, my voice sharp with desperation, "Why don't you stop him?" Her face, folded lips trembling, but all she said was, "We need him. I can't do this alone." The words stung more than the bruises. We need him. As if a man who gambled away his paycheck and split ribs with his fists was a necessity, but dependency had fused itself into her bones and no amount of pleading could shake it. By my last year of high school, I was exhausted but stubborn. I worked double shifts at Dunkin', saving every dollar, determined that UMass Amherst would be my escape. I pictured myself walking across the green and Amherst books in my arms, no Rick hovering at the edges of my life. That dream kept me alive through the worst nights. But Rick must have sensed it. He had a way of sniffing out hope, then crushing it before it could bloom. He started timing my shifts, checking the hours, demanding to see my pay stubs. One evening, he cornered me in the hallway, his breath sour with whiskey. "You think you're walking out of here? Think again. You belong where I say you belong." His hand clamped down on my wrist, fingers digging into bone. I twisted free, adrenaline surging. "You don't own me," I snapped before I could stop myself. His face shifted, shock flashing before anger settled in. He raised his hand, but for once I didn't cower. I stared straight into his eyes, daring him. Something in my defiance startled him. He lowered his hand slowly, but his voice was a low growl. "Careful, girl. You don't want to find out what happens when you cross me." That was the night I realized defiance could protect me as much as silence had. Not physically, not yet. But inside, defiance kept the spark alive. It was also the night I noticed the insurance papers were missing from the drawer where I had seen them. Panic gnawed at me. He knew I'd looked. He knew I'd seen. And in his mind, that meant time was running out for me. From then on, everything felt accelerated. He grew more reckless with money, throwing bills on the table like weapons, then storming out again. My mother's silence deepened into complicity, her eyes avoiding mine whenever Rick barked orders. And me, I counted coins at night, feeling both closer and farther from freedom. I told myself, just a few more months. Get to Amherst. Get out. But escape isn't always on our schedule. Sometimes it's on theirs. The weeks before the crash tension thickened in the house. Rick's losses piled up the casino markers more aggressive. I overheard him in the garage, voice low and sharp as he argued with someone on the phone. I'll have it handled soon. Don't worry about her, me. I wanted to run then. Pack my backpack, take the jar, disappear. But fear of the unknown rooted me in place. I convinced myself I could survive just a little longer. That morning on Route 5 proved me wrong. Now in the hospital, replaying those years, I saw how the threads had been woven. Every bruise, every silence, every debt, every insurance form, all of it was part of a web that ended with me bleeding against a concrete barrier. It wasn't sudden. It was slow, deliberate years in the making. But what Rick hadn't accounted for was this survival. He thought the story ended with a crash, with a signature, with a payout. He hadn't planned for me to wake up. He hadn't planned for my defiance to outlive his violence. As I stared at the IV drip beside me, I made myself a promise. I wouldn't let those years of suffering be wasted. I wouldn't let his plan define my ending. If my childhood had been about silence, my future would be about voice. I would tell the story he wanted buried. I would stand in the places he thought he owned, the courtrooms, the restaurants, the headlines, and show the world what he had done. And when I thought of my father, his quiet strength, his unwavering love, I knew what he would say. You know the difference now, Aubrey. Protect yourself. Use your voice. The backstory wasn't just memory anymore. It was motive. And it was the foundation of the fight that was coming. The beeping of the heart monitor had become a steady companion, but now it felt more like a drumbeat of warning than reassurance. Each pulse reminded me I was alive. Yes, but also reminded me of the war waiting outside those hospital walls. Rick thought he had won. He thought he had convinced the world I was gone. But survival meant nothing if I stayed silent. Officer Janet Rivera returned 3 days after the crash, her presence sharp and steady like a blade cutting through fog. She brought with her a stack of documents, their edges crisp, their contents damning. Insurance forms with Rick's signature, a timeline of his calls the night of the accident. The credit slips from MGM Springfield showing the depth of his debt. She spread them across the tray table by my bed, like puzzle pieces falling into place. You see the pattern, don't you? She asked, her voice low but direct. I nodded, my throat tight. He planned it. Every detail. Her eyes softened slightly. And now, Aubrey, it's about more than survival. It's about exposure. People like him thrive in silence. We break that silence. We break him. Ben Walker leaned against the window arms, crossed, his gaze heavy on the documents. He didn't speak right away, but when he did, his voice carried the weight of history. Your father was my friend. He trusted me to watch out for you. I failed once by not seeing what was happening in that house. I'm not failing again. Those words pierced something in me, a reminder of the man I'd lost, and the man who had tried to replace him. My father's absence had left a hollow, but Ben's presence now filled it with a kind of borrowed strength. We began to strategize. Janet explained how public exposure would cut through Rick's lies faster than any quiet investigation. Fraudsters hide in paperwork. Abusers hide in family. But they can't hide when the truth comes out in front of everyone. The plan was to build undeniable evidence not just for the courtroom, but for the court of public opinion. And for that, they needed me not just alive, but willing to speak. At first, the thought made my stomach twist. I had spent years being silenced, my voice crushed under Rick's threats and my mother's pleas for obedience. Standing in public exposing everything felt like stripping bare wounds that hadn't even closed. But when I pictured him raising a glass at Sterling Grill toasting my death, something inside me hardened. He had stolen too much already. He wasn't going to steal my voice. Over the next week, my hospital room became less recovery ward and more evidence hub. Janet returned with security footage from Route 5, grainy, rain-smeared images that nonetheless showed intent. Rick's truck swerving hard toward the barrier, no sign of braking until the moment after impact. She also pulled traffic cam stills of him walking away, calmly phone to his ear. "This will speak louder than any testimony," she said, sliding the stills across to me. I stared at them, bile rising. There I was, bleeding in the wreckage while he strolled away like a man finishing an errand. The coldness in those images fueled me more than fear could. Ben, meanwhile, gathered witness statements. Mr. Chin, our neighbor, confirmed hearing Rick call me a walking ATM. Another witness from the casino admitted Rick had bragged about a big payout coming soon. Piece by piece, the picture sharpened. This wasn't an accident. It was a business plan written in blood. One evening, as the sky outside turned the color of bruised steel, Janet brought in a tape recorder. She set it gently on the tray. "Aubrey, I need your account. Every detail you remember from that night, from his words in the truck to when he walked away. This recording will be crucial." My hands trembled as I reached for the recorder, but then I thought of my father's voice telling me I was stronger than I knew. I pressed the red button, inhaled, and began. My words came halting at first, broken by tears, but as I described his smirk, his muttered promise of things will be easier soon, my voice steadied. By the time I recounted him whispering, "Stay down after the crash," my tone was iron. When I finished, Janet clicked the recorder off. "Good," she said simply. "Now we have your voice on record. That's something he can't erase." Ben nodded, his expression unreadable, but his hand tightened briefly on the bed rail. A gesture of solidarity. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like prey. I felt like a witness gathering strength, my silence sharpening into testimony. But strength brought new fears. What if he found out I was alive before we were ready? What if he came to finish what he started? Janet must have seen the worry flicker in my eyes. "He won't touch you here, and when we're ready, he won't be able to touch you ever again. We'll control the reveal, not him." That night, as the machines hummed beside me, I pictured the reveal. Not in court yet, but in public. A restaurant, a crowd, his friends, his lies unraveling in front of every witness he'd tried to charm. The humiliation would cut deeper than handcuffs, and then the courtroom would finish what exposure began. For years he'd made me feel invisible. Now invisibility was my weapon. He thought I was gone. He told the world I was gone, and when the truth struck, it would blindside him harder than any crash. The doctor said I was healing faster than they expected, though every step with the physical therapist felt like fire. My ribs screamed when I tried to sit upright, and the scars along my arm pulled tight whenever I reached for the walker. But I pushed myself harder than they asked. Pain was temporary. Exposure was permanent. Janet visited nearly every day, sometimes with Ben, sometimes alone. Each time she came, she brought another piece of the puzzle. One afternoon, she laid down a series of bank records, thick stacks of paper highlighted in yellow. "These are withdrawals Rick made in the weeks before the crash. Large sums pulled straight from his joint account with your mother. All of it went to cover markers at MGM Springfield." I scanned the pages, bile rising. Thousands upon thousands poured into slot machines and card tables while I scraped coins at Dunkin' Donuts. The contrast was almost laughable if it weren't so devastating. "He was broke," I whispered. Janet nodded. "And desperate. Desperation fuels risk. That's why he turned to you. In his mind, you were a $3 million bailout." The thought made my skin crawl. To him, I wasn't family. I was currency. Later that week, Ben brought photos from Sterling Grill. A waitress had quietly passed them along Rick at a corner table, steak half-finished, bourbon in hand. His face wasn't grief-stricken. It was smug. He leaned back in his chair, telling anyone who would listen about the tragic accident that took his stepdaughter. He was celebrating, Ben said, disgust heavy in his voice. I stared at those photos until my vision blurred. That was the moment my fear hardened into resolve. He had toasted my death like it was a victory. He had no idea the ghost he thought he buried was still alive, gathering proof to burn his empire of lies. The plan to expose him crystallized in those days. Janet laid it out carefully, her voice steady, methodical. First, we gather irrefutable evidence done. Second, we control the timing. He believes you're gone. That's his blind spot. We'll hit him where he feels safest. Public. Surrounded by people who know him, the humiliation will strip him before the arrest even lands. Ben leaned forward, his hands clasped. He's throwing a celebration of sorts at Springfield's Tavern this weekend, bragging that the insurance claim is already moving. If we move, then we'll have maximum witnesses. The thought of facing him so soon made my chest tighten, but I nodded. Do it. Just don't tell him I'm alive until I can see his face when it all falls apart. Janet's eyes flickered with approval. You'll get that moment, but until then, stay invisible. The element of surprise is everything. The next days were a blur of preparation. Officers visited my room with copies of testimonies. Neighbors described hearing Rick scream about money. A casino worker admitted Rick told him, "My luck's turning around, got a big payout lined up." A paper trail, a witness trail, a motive trail, it all pointed in one direction. Even my mother's silence became evidence. She hadn't come to the hospital. She hadn't called. She hadn't done anything but stand by him. Janet called it passive complicity. I called it betrayal. The night before the tavern sting, I barely slept. Machines beeped steadily, but my thoughts raced louder. I pictured Rick raising a glass again, smirking as he bragged about my death. But this time, I imagined the interruption, the doors opening, officers walking in, voices ringing out. The humiliation would be sharp, public, irreversible. Ben sat with me that evening, his presence steady. "You don't have to be there," he said gently. "We can handle the arrest. You can stay safe here." But safety wasn't enough anymore. "I need to see it," I said firmly. "I need to watch his face when he realizes I'm not buried. That's my justice." Ben's eyes softened, sadness shadowing them. "Your father would have wanted you protected." I swallowed hard. He'd also want me to finish what Rick started, to prove I'm stronger than his lies. Ben didn't argue. He just squeezed my hand, the gesture warm, grounding. The morning of the sting, the hospital released me for a few hours under supervision. I was still bruised, stitched my arm in a sling. But Janet assured me it was enough. "Your presence isn't weakness, Aubrey. It's proof." We drove past the Connecticut River, its gray surface rippling under a cold breeze. The same river that had run beside Route 5 the night of the crash. For a moment, I closed my eyes, breathing in its steady rhythm. Life kept flowing no matter how many times someone tried to stop it. As Springfield's Tavern came into view, my heart pounded. Through the tinted glass of the cruiser, I saw the glow of warm lights, laughter spilling into the street. Inside, Rick would be holding court, spinning his story, his glass lifted in triumph. But tonight, the story would end differently. Tonight, the world would see him not as a grieving stepfather, but as the fraud and would-be murderer he was. I straightened in my seat, pain flaring, but resolve stronger. He had declared me dead. The police had written me off. But now, I would become the witness to his undoing. And when the doors of that tavern swung open, the life he thought he'd stolen would rise to meet him alive and unbroken. The tavern smelled of spilled beer and grilled steak when the officers pushed open the door, but from where I sat in the unmarked cruiser across the street, it felt like the air carried poison. My chest tightened with every passing second, each breath sharper than the last. The windows fogged from the warmth of the crowd inside, laughter spilling out when the door swung open for late arrivals. I could almost see him at the back table, his tie loosened, a drink in his hand, the picture of false confidence. Janet crouched beside me in the back seat, her voice calm but steady. "Remember, Aubrey, you don't have to step inside. Just watch from here. He won't see you until we're ready." I nodded, clutching the strap of my sling. My arm ached, my ribs still tender, but it was nothing compared to the fire inside me. For years, I had dreamed of him being held accountable, of someone finally tearing the mask off. Tonight, it was happening. Through the tavern's front window, I caught glimpses of the scene. Rick sat with two of his casino buddies, plates half-cleared, glasses raised. His posture was loose, cocky, the way it always was when he thought the world bent to his will. He leaned back, talking too loudly, the kind of voice meant to be overheard. 3 million, he bragged, lifting his glass. They'll cut the check any day now. Sometimes fortune finally smiles, boys. The words sliced me open, but I clenched my jaw. He was still celebrating, still convinced my life had been reduced to a payout. Ben's voice crackled softly through the radio. Units in place, ready on my signal. The next seconds stretched like hours. My heart pounded against my ribs, each thud echoing in my ears. Then the tavern door swung wide and Janet stepped in first, her badge flashing under the amber lights. Ben followed his frame, broad, his voice carrying above the din. Rick Morrison, he announced, his tone sharp and unyielding. You're under investigation for insurance fraud and attempted murder. The tavern froze. Forks hovered mid-air, conversations cut short, chairs creaked as heads turned. For a heartbeat, the entire room was silent. Rick's glass froze halfway to his lips. His face shifted, first confusion, then annoyance, then something darker. He set the glass down with exaggerated calm, leaning back in his chair. What's this about? I just lost my stepdaughter. You're harassing a grieving man. The words nearly made me choke. Grieving. He spoke it like a shield, like he could weaponize my death against the truth. Janet didn't flinch. She slid a folder onto the table in front of him. Inside were the photos, the bank records, the insurance forms, evidence laid bare under the tavern lights. We have reason to believe you staged the crash on Route 5. We have witnesses, financial records, and surveillance footage. Her voice was sharp enough to cut through the thickest denial. The crowd murmured disbelief, rippling through the room. His casino buddies leaned back, their eyes darting distance already growing between them and the man they thought they knew. Rick scoffed, but his hands betrayed him, fingers twitching against the table. This is ridiculous! She's dead! Everyone knows it! And then Ben leaned in, his voice low, but carrying just enough. She isn't dead, Rick. She's alive, and she remembers everything. The words hit like thunder. Gasps rippled across the tavern. People leaned closer, their faces lit with shock. Rick's expression cracked. For the first time, I saw fear slip through the mask. From my seat across the street, my pulse surged. This was the moment I'd waited for, the unraveling. He had toasted my death, and now the truth was spilling out in front of every witness he'd ever tried to impress. Rick shot up from his chair, his voice rising. That's a lie? You're lying. His eyes darted around the tavern, searching for allies, but the crowd had already turned. Phones lifted, recording the spectacle, capturing every frantic denial. Janet remained unshaken. Sit down, Rick. The evidence speaks for itself. But he didn't. He lunged for the folder, scattering papers across the floor. The still of his truck, swerving into the barrier, landed face up near a waitress's feet. She bent down, picked it up, her eyes widening as she realized what she held. She showed it to the nearest table, and whispers spread like wildfire. He did it on purpose. He tried to kill her. The murmurs grew into a low roar, judgment rolling through the room. Rick's face reddened his denial. Louder, shriller. She was nothing. A burden. You don't understand. The room turned icy. His own words betrayed him. Nothing. A burden. Not the words of a grieving stepfather, but of a man exposed. Ben moved, then, his cuffs snapping open. Rick Morrison, you're under arrest. The tavern erupted in sound chairs, scraping glasses, clinking voices rising. Phones captured every angle as Ben twisted Rick's arms behind his back. Rick struggled, shouting curses, his face twisted with fury, but the cuffs locked shut with a final click, sealing his downfall. I pressed my forehead against the cool window of the cruiser, breath shaking. My body still ached, stitched and bruised, but my spirit soared. For the first time in years, I wasn't the one silenced. He was. Janet's voice carried through the noise as she read him his rights. The tavern audience, diners, waitresses, bartenders watched every second, their eyes sharp with judgment. Rick's empire of lies had collapsed not in private, but under the glow of neon lights and the scrutiny of strangers. And I was alive to see it. The flashing lights painted the tavern's windows red and blue, turning the warm glow inside into something harsh and surgical. I stayed in the cruiser, watching through glass as people pressed closer to record Rick being dragged out in handcuffs. His shouts echoed down the street, spilling into the night air. "This isn't over. You can't do this. She's dead." He was still clinging to the lie, even as the world witnessed the truth unravel. Ben opened the back door and slid in beside me, his voice low but steady. "You don't have to look anymore, Aubrey. He's finished." But I couldn't tear my eyes away. After years of seeing him swagger through our house like a tyrant, untouchable and cruel, here he was reduced to a spectacle, shoved into the back of a patrol car like the criminal he was. His face pressed against the window, red and twisted with rage, his eyes scanning the street for someone to save him. No one did. The crowd outside began to buzz with gossip, strangers shaking their heads, muttering words I couldn't hear but could imagine. Murder, insurance, stepdaughter. Everyone in Springfield would know by morning. For once, Rick couldn't control the story. Janet slid into the driver's seat and pulled us away from the curb. As the cruiser rolled past the tavern, I allowed myself a small smile, though my chest ached from holding in so much tension. I saw a man I recognized from the casino slap another on the shoulder, both of them laughing at Rick's humiliation. The same people who had once bought him drinks now celebrated his downfall. I whispered almost to myself. He thought money would buy silence. But money can't hide everything. Ben glanced at me, his expression thoughtful. And tonight proves it. Sometimes the community needs to see the mask fall off. Public truth carries a weight, private justice never can. The ride back to the station blurred together the city streets slick with rain, neon reflections bending across the windshield. I leaned against the seat, exhaustion wrapping around me. But beneath the weariness was something stronger, relief. For the first time, Rick's voice wasn't the loudest in the room. At the station, I stayed in a quiet office while they processed him. From the hallway, I heard fragments of his shouting. He demanded a lawyer, cursed at the officers claimed he was being set up. But the walls muffled his rage, and it sounded smaller, somehow contained. Janet brought me a cup of tea in a paper cup. "You did well tonight. You didn't have to face him directly, but your presence mattered. He knows you're alive. He knows his story is over." I wrapped my hands around the warm cup, grateful for the steadiness in her voice. "I thought I'd feel more triumphant," I admitted. "Instead, I just feel empty." She nodded. "That's normal. He took so much from you. Justice doesn't refill the space he carved out, but it keeps him from carving more." The words sank deep, and for a moment I fought back tears. I had promised myself I wouldn't cry in front of them, not when I wanted to prove my strength. But tears came anyway, hot and unstoppable, soaking into the sleeves of my sweatshirt. Janet said nothing, just sat across from me, letting me be. Later that night, they released me into David's care. He stood waiting in the lobby, his arms crossed, jaw clenched. When he saw me, his expression softened, and he opened his arms. I stepped into the embrace, my body fragile against his solid frame. I saw the news alerts already. He murmured into my hair. "Half of Springfield knows what happened at that tavern. He can't escape this now." I pulled back, wiping my cheeks. I watched him brag about $3 million. I heard him toast it like my life was nothing. David's face hardened again, but his voice stayed calm. "And now he's the one with nothing. Tonight was the first step, Aubrey. There's still the trial, but he'll never walk into a room with his head high again." We drove home in silence, the wipers steady against the glass. Every street corner seemed different now, as though the city had shifted along with my story. The same Springfield that once felt like a cage now felt like a witness. Every diner, every streetlight, every passerby had seen the mask ripped off Rick Morrison. When we pulled into the driveway, I hesitated before stepping inside. The house looked the same, the porch light glowing, the curtains drawn, but it no longer belonged to him. It belonged to me and my mother, though even she would have to face her own reckoning. I lay awake that night, the sounds of the arrest replaying in my mind. The gasps, the murmurs, the sight of his wrists bound. Over and over, I saw the shift in his face when Ben said I was alive. That single moment his certainty shattered was worth every bruise, every stitch, every sleepless night. And yet, beneath the satisfaction was grief. Grief for the years I lost under his shadow, for the girl I had been before he crushed so much of me. Justice had begun, but healing would take longer. The next morning, the Springfield Republican ran the headline in bold black letters, "Stepfather arrested in 3MR insurance scam, stepdaughter alive." My name was buried in the third paragraph, but that didn't matter. The truth was printed. The whole city would read it over coffee and eggs, and Rick's name would never recover. At Dunkin', where I used to pull long shifts, coworkers texted me screenshots. Some customers had already come in, shaking their heads, sharing the story like wildfire. "That monster used to sit at my counter," one woman wrote, "and all along he was plotting this." By noon, it was all over Facebook. My phone buzzed with messages, half from people I hadn't spoken to in years, half from strangers sending words of support. For once, the noise didn't feel suffocating. It felt like a tide turning in my favor. That night, as I sat on the porch with David, the air smelled of wet leaves and wood smoke. I let the cool night sink into my bones, grounding me. He handed me a folded copy of the newspaper. "Keep this," he said. "One day when you doubt yourself, remember the night you helped take him down." I traced the ink with my finger, my name small but steady in the middle of the article. I wasn't just a victim anymore. I was the survivor who lived to tell the truth. The morning of the trial smelled like rain-soaked asphalt and nerves. Hampton County Superior Court loomed gray and cold, its columns streaked with years of weather, the kind of place where truth was dragged out kicking and screaming into the light. I sat on the wooden bench outside the courtroom, my arm still bound in a sling, a folder of documents on my lap. My reflection stared back at me from the polished marble floor, pale scarred but steady. For the first time, I wasn't walking into a fight alone. Inside, the room was already crowded. Reporters jostled in the back rows, their cameras clicking softly. Strangers from Springfield filled the benches, people who had read the headlines and wanted to see the monster behind them. My mother sat 3 rows back, her face drawn and colorless. She wouldn't look at me. I tried not to look at her either. Then the deputies brought him in. Rick Morrison, shackled at the wrists, orange jumpsuit hanging loose on shoulders that once seemed unshakable. He scanned the room with darting eyes, desperate for allies, but the crowd looked back with nothing but judgment. His gaze landed on me and lingered, a flash of shock crossing his face, like he still couldn't reconcile that I was here alive, sitting upright. He looked away first. That was victory enough to steady my breath. The judge entered, a tall woman with silver hair and a voice sharp enough to cut through steel. "Court is now in session. The people of Massachusetts versus Richard Morrison." Her words rolled across the room, heavy and absolute. The prosecutor stood laying out the case with calm precision. "Insurance fraud, attempted murder, a calculated scheme to profit from my death." Each word pressed heavier against my chest, but I held myself upright. When she gestured toward me, calling me to the stand, my legs trembled but carried me forward. The witness chair was harder than it looked. I gripped the edges, steadying myself as the oath settled on my tongue. My eyes drifted across the room, catching sight of Officer Ben Walker's nod, Officer Janet Rivera's watchful gaze, and David's steadying presence at the back. The prosecutor began softly. "Can you state your name for the record, Aubrey Collins?" My voice quivered, then found strength. "And what is your relationship to the defendant?" I glanced at Rick, his eyes narrowed like daggers. "He is my stepfather." The questions dug deep, peeling back years of silence. I spoke of nights when fists and words cut me into pieces of casino debts that turned our house into a war zone, of my mother's silence pressed over everything like a lid. My voice cracked, but I didn't stop. Then came the night on Route 5. I described the way the barrier rose up too fast, the way his hand didn't hesitate on the wheel, the way he left me bleeding while dialing 911 to declare me gone. The courtroom air felt heavy, every ear straining to catch each syllable. "Why didn't he try to help you?" the prosecutor asked. "Because he didn't want me to survive," I answered. My words landed like a stone, dropped into a still pond, ripples spreading through the courtroom. She showed the jury the insurance policy $3 million, my name spelled out in bold. Gasps rose from the benches. The paper looked cold, clinical, but to me it was a death sentence written in ink. Rick's lawyer tried to rattle me on cross-examination. He asked if I was mistaken, if maybe Rick had lost control of the truck in the rain. I stared him down. I remember the look on his face, I said. It wasn't fear. It was satisfaction. The jury leaned forward, watching me, and I saw in their eyes they believed me. Then came the footage. The grainy highway camera showed Rick's truck swerving with deliberate force. Frame by frame, the truth flickered across the screen. The room was silent, each image louder than words. Neighbors testified too. One described hearing Rick call me an ATM with legs. Another remembered him bragging at the casino about a payday coming soon. Piece by piece, the puzzle of his greed snapped into place. Finally, the prosecutor rested and the judge's gavel echoed. The jury will deliberate. Hours passed, but it felt like years. I sat with David in the hallway, the hum of vending machines filling the silence. He handed me a bottle of water I couldn't bring myself to open. Every tick of the clock pressed heavier on my chest. When the bailiff called us back and my stomach flipped. The jury filed in their faces, unreadable. My pulse thundered in my ears. The foreman stood. We, the jury, find the defendant Richard Morrison guilty of insurance fraud and guilty of attempted murder. The room erupted in gasps. My body sagged with relief, so sudden it made me dizzy. The judge's gavel cracked the air again, demanding order. Rick's face crumpled, all the arrogance drained away. He shouted, "You're all liars! She was supposed to be dead!" The deputies restrained him, dragging him back, as the judge's voice thundered. "Richard Morrison, you are sentenced to 25 years in prison." The finality of it rang in my bones. For years he had been a storm I couldn't escape. Now he was caged, his voice swallowed by bars. Susan was called next. She stood trembling, head bowed. The judge spoke with measured gravity. "For your role in enabling and concealing these crimes, you are sentenced to 2 years probation with mandatory counseling." My mother sobbed silently, but I felt no pity. She had chosen her silence, and silence had consequences. As I walked out of the courthouse, the September air felt cleaner, sharper. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions, but their noise barely touched me. What mattered was the weight that had lifted the truth spoken, the lies shattered, the sentence sealed. For the first time since I was 12, the world felt safe enough to breathe in fully. And I did. The courthouse was behind me, but the ripples of the verdict spread far beyond its marble walls. Within 24 hours, the Springfield Republican ran a front-page headline that seemed to echo through every corner of my city. Stepfather plotted 3M insurance scam, stepdaughter survived. Seeing those words printed in bold black ink was like watching a tombstone being carved not for me, but for Rick Morrison's reputation. By the end of the week, every paper in Massachusetts had picked it up. Boston Globe ran a profile of the case, calling it a chilling story of greed and survival. WGBH News devoted a whole segment to the trial, replaying the footage of Rick being led away in cuffs. Even the smaller outlets, the community bulletins, the local radio stations buzzed with his name, no longer spoken with fear or respect, but with disgust. Rick had built his image around control. At the casino, he was the smooth talker with a drink in hand. In the neighborhood, he was the man with a polished lawn and sharp clothes. In our house, he was the tyrant. But none of that survived the spotlight of public humiliation. Now, when people spoke his name, they lowered their voices not out of reverence, but out of shame. His assets were seized within days. The insurance payout was frozen, the claim dismissed as fraudulent. The house he had lorded over us was repossessed. His golf clubs, his watches, the flashy car he used to polish every Sunday, they all went into storage to be auctioned. For a man who once bragged about 3-hour lunches and expensive cigars, the orange jumpsuit and steel bars were the cruelest kind of poetry. And then there was Susan, my mother. She walked out of that courtroom with probation and a shadow trailing her every step. The Springfield community turned its back on her almost overnight. At the grocery store, people whispered as she passed. At church, heads turned coldly away. The woman who once pretended not to see my bruises now had nowhere to hide from the world's judgment. I saw her once at the pharmacy on State Street. She was standing in line with a carton of milk, her face pale, her shoulders hunched. For a moment our eyes met, and I saw the recognition, the regret, but it was too late. She looked away first, fumbling with her wallet, and I walked out before she reached the counter. She had made her choice years ago. The community's verdict was only an echo of mine. For me, the aftermath felt like stepping into sunlight after years underground. Reporters reached out for interviews. At first, I resisted wanting only silence and rest. But then I realized my story wasn't just mine anymore. It belonged to every girl who had been told to stay quiet to endure to survive. So I sat in front of the cameras and told it. I spoke of the bruises, the fear, the crash, the betrayal, and the courtroom where truth finally stood taller than lies. The messages poured in after that. Emails from women in Boston, letters from survivors in Worcester, even a card from an elderly couple in Northampton who said my story gave them courage to speak out against their own abusive son-in-law. Each word was a reminder that I wasn't just reclaiming my life, I was helping others reclaim theirs. Still, nights were complicated. I'd wake in a cold sweat hearing the echo of Rick's voice from the tavern bragging about money like my life had never mattered. Sometimes I replayed the crash in my mind, the barrier rising, the metal crunching the silence after impact. But then I remembered the courtroom, the gavel, the word, guilty, and it steadied me. Justice didn't erase the scars, but it gave them meaning. One evening, David and I walked downtown, and I noticed the posters taped in shop windows. Springfield Against Domestic Violence joined the vigil. My name was listed as a speaker. I hadn't even agreed yet, but the organizers had faith I'd show up. And they were right. I did. That night, I stood on the steps of City Hall, candles flickering around me, the crowd holding its breath. I spoke about fear, about greed, about what it meant to survive when someone tried to erase you for money. My voice shook at first, but as I looked into the crowd, faces old and young men and women all holding candles, I felt the strength rise in me. The words came easier, fuller. I ended with the truth that had carried me from Route 5 to that courthouse. They left me bleeding for $3 million. They thought I was dead. But I'm here, and I'm not leaving quietly. Applause rose like a wave washing over me. For once, the noise didn't frighten me. It lifted me. Rick sat in prison as all of this unfolded, but the downfall reached him even there. Ben told me through his contacts that Rick struggled behind bars. No allies, no money to bribe favors, no friends to prop up his ego. He was just another inmate with a number instead of a name. Word spread fast in prison, and men who had lost money at casinos didn't treat him kindly. Every Thursday, the casino crowd at MGM Springfield toasted not to him, but to his downfall. Here's to the man who thought greed was smarter than justice. They'd laugh raising cheap beers. His old haunts had erased him, but not his shadow. That shadow would linger as a cautionary tale long after he rotted behind bars. The Boston Globe asked me one last question during their feature. What do you hope people remember about your story? I didn't hesitate. That justice is possible even when it feels impossible. That silence only protects the guilty, and that survival is the loudest revenge. By then, the word survivor no longer felt foreign. It felt like a name I had earned. The first morning I woke up in Amherst, sunlight spilled through the dormitory window in a way I hadn't seen in years. It wasn't filtered through blinds chosen by Rick or darkened by the heaviness of our old house. It was soft, unclaimed, my own. I lay there listening to the chatter of students in the hallway, the slam of a door down the corridor, the hum of campus life beginning around me. For the first time since I was 12, I felt safe enough to stretch my arms without fear of who might notice. UMass Amherst was bigger than I'd imagined, a place humming with possibility. The scholarship I received at the Survivor Resilience Fund was more than financial help. It was a message. Someone believed I wasn't just a victim of Route 5 or Rick Morrison's greed. I was a survivor with a future worth investing in. Carrying that thought in my chest each day felt like armor. Classes filled my mornings, the smell of coffee and paper everywhere, professors talking about futures that felt wide and open. At first, I struggled to focus. The sound of someone dropping a book too loudly in the library could send me back to the crash, my heart thudding as if metal was bending around me again. But with time, I learned to breathe through it to ground myself in the present. Each scar on my body became less of a reminder of what was taken from me and more of proof of what I had survived. At night, I'd sit at my desk, my lamp casting a soft glow over notebooks, and I'd run my fingers along the ridge of the scar near my temple. I called it my map to freedom. Every line of it reminded me I had clawed my way back to life when someone tried to take it. Some people wear jewelry or charms for strength. I had scars, and they were enough. Ben and Janet didn't vanish after the trial. They checked in often, sometimes visiting campus, sometimes sending short messages. Ben brought me a Springfield police pin, once pressing it into my palm like it was a talisman. "Your father would have been proud," he said. I kept it in my desk drawer, a quiet reminder of the man I had lost and the people who had stepped in when others failed me. David, too, never wavered. He drove out on weekends, bringing groceries or just sitting with me in the student center. Sometimes we didn't talk about the case at all. Sometimes we just ate pizza and complained about traffic. Those were the nights that mattered most, reminders that life could be ordinary again. I found myself joining a survivor group on campus. At first, I only listened, sitting in the circle as others told their stories. Women, men young and old, each of us carrying invisible weight. Eventually, I began to speak too. The first time I said out loud, "My stepfather tried to kill me for insurance money," the room didn't shrink away. They nodded, they understood, and the silence that followed was full of solidarity, not pity. With every meeting, I felt stronger. My story no longer felt like a wound I had to hide. It became a bridge connecting me to others. Together, we weren't broken. We were proof that survival was louder than silence. One autumn afternoon, I walked along the pond on campus, the trees aflame with orange and red. The air smelled of leaves and wood smoke, the wind cool against my face. For a moment, I stopped and closed my eyes, letting it wash over me. This was what freedom felt like. Not dramatic, not triumphant. Just quiet and true and entirely mine. That night, I returned to my dorm and opened my laptop. There was an email from the Boston Globe asking if I would be willing to write an op-ed about survival and resilience. I stared at the blinking cursor for a long time, then began to type. The words poured out, not polished or perfect, but real. I wrote about scars as maps, about silence as poison, about the way justice can arrive late, but still arrive. By the time I hit send, I felt lighter. The next week, when the piece was published, students I didn't even know stopped me on campus to say thank you. One girl hugged me with tears in her eyes, whispering that my story gave her courage to leave someone hurting her. In that moment, I understood my pain hadn't been wasted. It had become something bigger than me. Nights in Amherst grew easier. I decorated my dorm with photos that made me smile, me and David at the vigil, Ben and Janet outside the courthouse. Even Mrs. Chin from next door holding her soup pot. The walls were mine now, not a canvas for Rick's control, but a collage of resilience. One evening, as I packed for a weekend back in Springfield, I looked at myself in the mirror. My shoulder was stronger, my skin dotted with thin, silver scars. The girl staring back was not the one who once cowered in silence. She was scarred, yes, but steady, her eyes sharper, her spine straighter. I whispered to my reflection, "You made it out." And for the first time, I believed it fully. Route 5 looked different in daylight. The last time I'd seen it, twisted metal and broken glass had turned the asphalt into a nightmare. Now, months later, it was just a stretch of road lined with bare winter trees, quiet except for the steady hum of traffic. I pulled over at the shoulder, cutting the engine, letting the silence settle around me. My hands tightened around the steering wheel, but this time they weren't shaking from fear. I stepped out, the cold air biting at my cheeks, and stood at the barrier where Rick had tried to erase me. The metal had been replaced since the crash, the fresh steel gleaming under the weak sun. There were no scars left on the road, no skid marks, no shards of glass. It was as though the state had swept away every trace of what happened here. Only I carried the memory. For a long time, I just stood there listening. Cars whooshed past, indifferent their drivers, unaware that the pavement beneath their tires had once been soaked in my blood. That was the strangest part, how life moved on, how people kept driving, kept living, while I had been caught in the wreckage. I closed my eyes and heard it all again, the crunch of metal, the scream of sirens, the silence when I thought it was my last breath. And then, Rick's voice echoing like a curse, "She's gone. She's dead." Except I wasn't. I opened my eyes, pressing my palm against the cold barrier. "You failed," I whispered, not to the road, not to the steel, but to the ghost of the man who thought greed was stronger than survival. "I'm still here." The memory of his face in the tavern flickered in my mind the exact moment Ben told him I was alive. That was the real turning point. Not the crash, not the insurance papers, not even the trial. It was that instant when every ounce of his certainty collapsed under the truth he couldn't deny. That memory had carried me through nights when the scars ached and the nightmares returned. It reminded me that survival itself was the loudest form of revenge. When I turned back toward my car, I noticed a small cluster of flowers tucked against the barrier. Fresh wrapped in paper, their stems still wet. I bent down, curious. A note was attached. For all who survived. For all who didn't. No signature. Just a quiet offering from someone who understood that roads hold stories even when the asphalt looks clean. I left the flowers where they were and drove back toward Amherst, the weight in my chest lighter than it had been in months. That evening, I sat at my desk in the dorm, the window cracked open to let in the cold air. Students laughed outside, their voices drifting across the courtyard. I pulled out my journal, the same one I'd started in the hospital when my handwriting shook with pain. Now the words came steady. I wrote about the road, about the flowers, about the truth that couldn't be paved over. And as I wrote, I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to feel before peace. Not the fragile, temporary kind that comes from silence. Real peace. The kind built on scars and survival on truth spoken loudly enough that it could never be buried again. Ben called that night, his voice warm with pride. "I heard about the vigil next month. You're speaking again?" "Yeah," I said, smiling into the phone. "I think it's time." "You've come a long way, Aubrey," he said softly. "Your father would have been proud." After the call, I sat in bed, the quiet settling around me. For years, silence had been my prison. Now, it was my sanctuary. I looked at the scars in the mirror one last time before turning off the light. They weren't ugly. They weren't reminders of loss. They were proof. Proof that I had walked through fire and lived. Proof that no amount of money, no scheme, no act of violence could erase me. And as I lay down, I thought of Rick in his cell staring at concrete walls instead of casino lights. His empire of lies crumbled. I thought of Susan walking the aisles of Springfield grocery stores under the weight of stares she couldn't escape. Their downfall wasn't just legal, it was social, spiritual, permanent. The world knew them for what they were. Me, I was something else entirely. Alive, free, louder than ever. They left me bleeding for $3 million. They declared me dead. But here I am, breathing, thriving, and telling my story so the world knows that justice sometimes takes time, but it comes. And if you've listened this far, if you've felt even a piece of what I carried on Route 5, then I need you to pause right here. Tell me, have you ever seen someone value money more than life? Drop your answer in the comments. And if you believe survival is the loudest revenge, hit that subscribe button so you never miss stories like this. Because mine isn't the only one, and together we make sure silence never wins.